Hello, thanks for joining us. I'm Thanasi Kambanis, Director of Century International. Today, we're here to talk about a global crisis in citizenship and rights and what we can learn by taking a transnational approach. We've just completed a 2-year project at Century International where we brought together experts who worked on related issues in the Middle East, North Africa region, and in Western Europe and North America. So we picked four four major areas of what we see as the crisis of our time: militia violence, gender and sexuality, police accountability, and protest movements. And we brought together people who've been studying policy and practice in those areas across regions. And over the last 2 years, we've been holding discussions about what are the common elements of the crisis we face and what are the common elements in the possible solutions. Uh, Today, we're joined by four members of the project, and I'm going to introduce them as I bring them in with their first questions. And we're hopefully going to get a pretty grand tour of the ways in which this transnational crisis is interconnected, and some of the insights that we think the project helped us identify in how to resist creeping authoritarianism and the erosion of rights. Without any further ado, I'm going to go right into talking about the project with the director, Naira Antoun. She's a fellow at Century International, and over the last 2 years, she's been directing the dialogues and the reports of the Transnational Trends in Citizenship Initiative. So Naira, start off by telling us what did you find to be the utility of looking at these two regions, the Middle East and the West, or MENA and Western Europe and North America, in the same frame? What did the initiative find?
Yeah, thanks, Thanasi. Yeah, I might actually answer that a tiny bit obliquely by suggesting, if you were to bring together different regions, two or more of the global South together, there's something kind of intuitive about that, right? Different parts of the world sort of similarly positioned in relation to the global economy, the global architecture of power. Here, by bringing the Middle East and Western world together, sort of regions we might put in inverted commas perhaps, essentially it's one region that's essentially the architects of power, and a region that's very much shaped and intervened in. So they're pretty much never brought together in this way. And when we bring them together, so for instance, you might consider informal housing in Egypt and India, and no one would blink twice. But for similar phenomena are never, across these two regions, are pretty much never brought alongside each other. And when we do, we essentially see those issues in a context that's global, regional, local, regional, and global, and then we can just generate much more insights into the phenomena themselves, into unseen connections, and into sort of the multiple global crises that we're
in. And I think you found it important that we don't talk about this as a sort of exercise in comparisons. Why is that?
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, that's true. I think that because while some comparative thought did take place throughout the project, I think it's perhaps better described as kind of transnational thinking. And so that's this idea of, when you look at one issue, it's not necessarily to find similarities and differences, but to sort of put them in the same scale and in the same frame, and see how they are similarly related to one another or to other global forces. And so that deepens our understanding, perhaps, let's say, of the 2008 financial crisis. So it actually enables us to get into deeper questions beyond what's similar or not, I think.
And we chose four specific areas of study that basically me and Naira thought about a whole menu of things we could have chosen. And I mean, it's funny, you just mentioned informal housing. We could have looked at social phenomena, homelessness. We could have looked at domestic violence. We chose militias, police accountability, gender, sexuality, and protest, because those were some of the spaces that seemed really connected to the crisis in democracy that we all face. And one of the things that was interesting to me as we undertook these years of conversations was in some cases anyway, there was a real discomfort with talking about, say, militias in Yemen and militias in the U.S. And some people were immediately like, well, the scale is so different, the risks are totally different. Why are we even talking about these in the same conversation? And I found that very revealing, because we're asking a question. The answer won't always be that there is a causal connection or that there is a parallel, although it seems like more often than not there was such a connection. Let me turn to another participant in the project, Lubna Darwish, and the rest of you panelists, if you haven't, go ahead and turn on your cameras if you want. We don't have to come in like at the Oscars one by one. Lubna Darwish is the Gender and Human Rights Officer at the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, which is one of the most enduring and important rights groups in Egypt. Lubna, can you explain a bit how gender and sexuality help us understand and address the global erosion of rights and the resurgence of authoritarianism? And I'm interested especially in how gender and sexuality fit as a way to think about policy emergencies alongside the other categories in this project: militias, police accountability, and mass protests.
Hi, thank you. So basically, it's gender and sexuality are kind of like a foreign concept when put with other the other concepts. But I think that what makes them very interesting to look at, because usually authoritarianism or police brutality or lack of accountability is seen, or even militarism is seen in the context of war on terror, militias, and these kind of practices. But it's very interesting to see how when a country or a community or whatever, in a place, in a locality, these practices are done in the context of anti-terrorism, for example. After a while, they trickle down to other issues, and you find a great manifestation, especially in sexuality and gender. Because, when there is this authoritarian moment, we all know that the family and women become very, very important symbols of carrying the national identity and the national kind of true identity of a society or a country. So in our case, for example, the values of the Egyptian family become a very, very important concept. And you find that these practices that have become a norm within the police system or the criminal system on its own, or in courts, find clear manifestations when it comes to women. For example, we find in the last 2 years, we've seen a new rise to what the general prosecution calls social state security, which is a new term they refer to when they talk about basically public morality. And they extend the definition of public morality to basically include private life, private self-expression of women and LGBT individuals, of course, and girls and young girls, their self-expression, and becomes monitored and becomes seen not only as a way to monitor or police private life, but clearly as a patriotic mission. And that it's clearly related to the war on terror, that on one side will be the government is fighting terrorism in the meaning of fundamental Islamism, but on the other side, it's fighting all these new ideas that are as dangerous, whatever they are, like feminism, LGBT rights, any kind of gender and sexuality conversations. And this is done under a clear flag of patriotism and national interest, basically.
Yeah, this is something that I see really direct and distressing parallels, and maybe sort of even borrowing of techniques across regimes. I definitely thought in the sort of early years when the Egyptian state was trying to crush the popular revolt in 2011, that there was a real overt harnessing of anti-gay and anti-woman sentiment as a way of not just mobilizing regime support, but I think co-opting people into acts of violence. So you start by a bathhouse raid on a supposedly gay bathhouse, or on attacking women who are in a demonstration who are supposedly loose, and there's widespread public support in some quarters for this act, and then once they're on board with that act of repression against a sort of gendered target group, then they can be brought on board for a more widespread project of reasserting state authority and violence. And what's interesting about that is that I think a lot of the conversations about gender and sexuality always focus on the other group or the weaker group, as if say for men there is no issue of gender and sexuality, or for heterosexual people there's no issue of gender and sexuality. It's only something that applies to some minority group or weak group. But when you talk about this in your work and in this thing about mobilizing for the security state, how would you encourage us to think about it differently? Sorry for that being a very long question.
No. So I would like to add to what you just said. Not only is there was this moment 2011 in crashing, trying to crush the momentum with basically using violence against women, but also when you look at 2013 as a historical moment, one of the main flags of protection was actually protection of women. I mean, the state took power and claimed all the time that this is for the good of women, because the other government would have been attacking women's rights. So under this kind of mission of protection of women, a woman is constructed, a certain woman is constructed, a certain woman is protected, but all other kind of womanhood or girlhood or presence as citizens actually who happen to be women or girls is prohibited, because does not work with basically the narrative of the state. To what you were saying, actually, that's exactly what we've been discussing the last 2 years. So they start when there is such morality freak out or a morality security crackdown. They usually start with LGBT groups, women, but actually it gets into the private life of everybody after a while, because these groups open the door for everybody to be violated afterwards. And we see now around us that the same terms and legal articles have been used with women, and especially poor women, are now used against men or different categories, against non-believers, are used against different groups of society. But it starts with these most what we can call, are called vulnerable groups. And you see this is as well on the issue of marriage, for example, how the state is protecting marriage against the will of everybody involved basically in marriage, but basically protecting this institution and putting it in a mold that it would not change. And that is actually, its effect is not only on women, it's women and men as well.
And the parallels are obvious to things like the "Don't Say Gay" bill in Florida, or the critical race theory panic in the U.S. It's almost, it's funny, but it's not funny to see people who a few years ago in the U.S. would have said, "Oh, this thing in Egypt, that's so backwards to see this kind of thing happening," and then the literally exact same dynamic is unspooling across the United States, and you see that there, the running theme in this project: no region is immune, no country, however rich, however developed, however mature its democracy, is immune from these sorts of pressures. Let's turn to you, Amanda. Amanda Rogers is a fellow at Century International, and among other things, she studied both ISIS and white supremacists in the U.S. I want to ask you, what's the connection between these very different manifestations of armed group violence? And we were just talking with Lubna about gender and sexuality. Can you explain some of the common threads that draw on gender and sexuality that help explain links in recruitment and mobilization and violence of these kinds of groups across different contexts? Amanda, I think you're muted. There you are.
I can certainly try. That's a huge question.
Can we hear you, Amanda?
I don't know. Can you hear me? Yes.
Okay. It's just me who can't hear her. Fine.
Okay.
I'll figure that out.
All right, so he can hear this later on. But again, I will try to tackle this question. It's pretty complicated, and you could go on for days about it. But so I'm going to take on the first part, which is to talk about the connections between ISIS and transnational white supremacist actors. And I think what I'm going to say actually goes back to Naira, what you and Thanasi were talking about at the outset, about the problems of comparison, or the ability to bring these issues into the same terrain and on the same plane for discussion. I came at these in a very strange way. I got sucked in. I won't get into how, but basically I began to see the ways in which neo-Nazi groups and groups like ISIS are both reacting to and catalysts for the continuation of the zeitgeist in terms of the crisis of the nation state. There is globally an issue with affiliations of belonging that stretch beyond national borders because of things like the internet, right, on the one hand. And you have the same dynamics operating within different contextual histories. So, you're not going to look at the states and see a phenomenon like ISIS because you have a completely different historical and geopolitical contextual background that's operating there. Nonetheless, you have predominantly young men that are disaffected with certain kinds of affiliations, or certain kinds of, I suppose, resources to which they are entitled as citizens, or as participants in certain identity groups that's driving this. And it's not just an ISIS and transnational neo-Nazi issue. It's happening if you look, say, at India and the Hindutva movement and the BJP. You've got this all over the world right now, and it really is a global zeitgeist that I think speaks to the problems of nation state legitimacy in an era where borders are have been absolutely obliterated by things like the internet to a certain extent. So that's, on the one hand, part of the connection. But I also think it's key to point out that these actors might appear as if they are ideologically antithetical, sort of, to one another's ideas. Nonetheless, really, when we take it a step back and we look at the macro picture, they share the same objectives and outcomes. And that is basically erasing spaces of coexistence where multiplicities of identities and hybridities coexist, to have, a very black and white Manichaean sort of outlook on the world and citizenship configuration. So, for example, this would be illustrated by ISIS making an attack where they know Muslims in the West will be hurt, right? The reaction they are after is revenge violence in part. And the whole point is to drive a wedge between a Muslim, quote unquote, and a Westerner, quote unquote, even though those are obviously not, antithetical identities. But the similar thing happens with neo-Nazis and white supremacists transnationally.
It's like heightening the contradictions, kind of.
I'm sorry?
It's like a heightening the contradictions. Is that the?
It's not just the contradictions. Basically, these groups that are obsessed with identitarian affiliation at this moment of transnational crisis and citizenship configurations, basically will support anything that anyone does that hardens boundaries between groups and erases the space of coexistence and the space of, hybridity between different identities. So does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, so there's that aspect as well. And a lot of times there are members that do operationally cooperate, but the bigger issue, I think, among all of these groups that are operating in the same environment in terms of that zeitgeist transnationally, is the fact that they share certain reactions to a nation state, a citizenship idea, and celebrate others even if they don't agree, often very cynically, right? It's sort of a, we'll embrace your actions and champion them among ourselves for mimicry, mimesis in terms of our operations, or we'll work with you until we have to basically commit genocide to get rid of you. But until then, hey, everything's fine, like Tom Metzger and the new Black Panther Party, for example. So you have those issues going on that I think set the stage somewhat. As to the second part of the question, the issue with gender that you raised, Thanasi, I think this is quite more complex than I have time really with the rest of my comment to go into. But succinctly, what I would say is that you have a parallel dynamic operating here, which is to say that there is a discomfort with the direction of the world. That's part of this whole zeitgeist and anti-feminism backlash that you see all around the world. You also have women themselves who are seeking out a counter feminism to a lot of the same issues that are taken up by, several different critics. So you have members of ISIS, members of neo-Nazi groups that speak an alternative feminist language and are trying to essentially use that discourse, co-opt it to some extent, people might say, for women's empowerment within a newly articulated identity for themselves. So I think that's important to keep in mind, that again is a part of the global zeitgeist and is operating similarly across these groups. The last thing that I would say about gender and sexuality as it relates to ISIS, neo-Nazis, and other groups like them is that I think that we need to be very cognizant of the fact that there is an assumption, right, that men are more important in these groups because they are violent. And I think that that is profoundly misguided. When we prioritize like a kinetic operation and the violent actors as the power holders, you are not only erasing half of humanity, but you're missing a lot of the dynamics that drive, sustain, and bolster these movements.
Yeah, I mean, I was just in Iraq last month, and I was interviewing former ISIS members who were sort of reintegrating into society. And these are the people who are, I think, in a sexist way, just ISIS brides or ISIS wives.
Jihadi brides.
Yeah, and in Iraq, the term is ISIS families. But actually, the people I was interviewing were ISIS members and supporters and active recruiters in their families of people joining this movement. And it's very, I mean, it's interesting to see how not only their role is sort of dismissed because they're women, but then there's like a security element missing. So in the response now, the state isn't really concerned with what these people are doing. And as I mean, this is ongoing research, but they are, continuing to embrace views and maybe political projects of ISIS within their communities. And because they're women, they're being ignored while they do it, which is, it goes to show how pernicious this framing can be. All right, I know we have more to say on this, but I want to turn to Nicole. Nicole Wen is an associate professor of educational policy studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and studies policing. Nicole, one of the main goals of this project was to identify actual connections, drivers, causal forces across national borders and regions between different elements of this global crisis in governance, rights, and democracy, and really in everything that we value and that's good. You've conducted a lot of field research into policing and the war on terror. How do you see the problems in policing and police accountability connected between the two regions we're talking about here, the Middle East and the West?
It is another giant question, so I'll try to chip away something small and concrete to sort of get the conversation going. So I guess the first thing I'll say is that we know that when the US goes to war with a foreign enemy, it also has to construct an enemy within, which leads to the expansion of domestic policing regimes. We see this following, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the crackdown on Japanese Americans, and more recently, sort of the direct targeting of Muslim and Arabs in the US. We can think concretely about this in terms of Chicago police officers, for example, who are specifically trained to conduct torture in Vietnam and later Guantanamo. And it's those same police officers who are then coming back to the United States to essentially interrogate and torture Black Chicagoans to similarly elicit false confessions. But I think what's more is that we also see sort of how shifts in military strategy, as in the counterinsurgency turn in Iraq, also reshape to win sort of hearts and minds in Iraq, also reshapes domestic policing practices. So security professionals in the US, for example, talked about the need to synchronize the hearts and minds approach in Iraq with non-kinetic anti-terrorism methods at home as a way to, allegedly rein in coercive or unjust policing, and therefore gain support for and the legitimacy of these sort of domestic war on terror operations and its articulations with military interventions elsewhere. And so we see in the United States sort of this rapid expansion of community policing programs that integrate Muslim communities, but we also see Black, Latinx, immigrant communities, and social service providers into the domestic war on terror by identifying and reporting potential threats. But as in Iraq, we see how these domestic policing programs actually expand police power rather than rein it in by deputizing ordinary people essentially as proxy national security agents and giving police access to even more intimate spaces of everyday life in the same way that US soldiers kind of had free reign over sort of everyday life in Iraq. And so we see this in countering violent extremism programs in the US, in the UK, as well as USAID funded projects across the MENA region as a way, again, to shore up support for these policing operations. So I think these, in part, sort of these circulations of how to manage police crises and police legitimacy is really important to understanding sort of global governance.
I mean, one of the questions that I had going into this project is how to sort of separate out the like rhetorical cycle from like changes in practice. So for example, in the US, we have a long history of police overreach, surveillance, infiltration of dissident groups by law enforcement agencies. So those things, predated 9/11. The rhetoric around them changed after 9/11, and some of the targets shifted. And so one question, sort of Western focused, is, did practice actually change? What was new or behavior in practice after 9/11? And in the Middle East, it was a sort of similar thing happened where repressive governments glommed on almost immediately to the language of the war on terror, and to the extent, and even to the extent where by the 2010s, Hezbollah in Lebanon was using American language about takfiri extremism and pluralism to justify repressive activity. And it was, on the one hand, amazing to see how this rhetoric sort of recycles. On the other hand, the practices in question were kind of the same, right? I mean, they were the same bad practices. So I'm wondering what's new in terms of the harm versus what's new in terms of the justification for sort of traditional ways of doling out repression.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything necessarily new. I do think it's the repackaging of the ideological frameworks to rationalize and justify what appear to be new policing arrangements, but in fact are not. So, in the US, you had the LA uprisings in 1992, and you had the rolling out of community policing programs. CVE is sort of a reiteration of those community policing programs that are a response to police crises. So essentially the police attempt to reinvent themselves, right, to appear more progressive or liberal or sort of whatever is the flavor of the day. That's that repackaging of ideological frameworks to rationalize police programs. So we see, for example, after the LA uprisings, that there's this narrative that the police are anti-Black. And by integrating Black folks into community policing programs, that we can somehow, rectify the problems with policing. The same is true with, this direct targeting of Muslims. If we just integrate Muslims into policing practices, we somehow solve the crisis of policing in the United States. So it's sort of an old handbook we're playing from. I think what's new is that, as sort of, things come in and out of focus. So for example, like this focus on civil rights and civil liberties sort of provides different frameworks to justify the same old practices. And so I think understanding sort of how policing practices ebbs and flows but never really changes is important to understanding how police power in the US, including through police reform, can function to maintain sort of the status quo.
Now, presumably, there are substantive changes that take place when, for example, tens of thousands of people go off to a foreign war and are, as the U.S. did in the war, wars on terror, or Egyptian soldiers being sent off, or police being sent off to a place like Sinai and being told that they can behave with even greater impunity than what they're used to, and then they're brought back to their base community where they, are supposedly subject to different, more restrictive rules of engagement. There must be measurable changes in practice that come from both the sort of human component of that, and I would guess the physical component, where you give people military equipment to do community policing. That must change the way they interact with the communities they police.
I think it's sort of a yes and no. I think maybe the velocity and intensity might change, but it is just new forms of state violence that's enacted against people, right? So when if Richard Zulli, who went to Guantanamo to torture detainees, right, was using the same practices in Guantanamo as he used in Chicago, right? And so in that sense, right, the practices are actually quite similar, and the kind of impunity that sort of makes this violence permissible is the same in Guantanamo as in a Chicago police facility. So I think it's important to note that sure, when you militarize and police agencies across the country, things change, but the sort of bedrock of what's going on hasn't fundamentally changed all that much. And that's why I think understanding the circulations is important, because I think sometimes we cast police violence as exceptional, and it's actually quite mundane and ordinary. And I think sometimes that we miss that because we're so focused on spectacular forms of police violence that we miss the very mundane and ordinary.
Well, that's actually a great segue to the next thing I wanted to ask Naira about. The war on terror accelerated a pre-existing deep and deeply militarized connection between the two regions that we looked at in this project. Our work takes as a starting point that all these crises are global, they're international, they're worldwide, but at the same time that there are some sort of specific dimensions to the connection of these crises between the Middle East and Western Europe, North America, and also some very specific problems with exceptionalism. Can you tell us a bit, Naira, about the ways in which the Middle East has been uniquely exceptionalized, and what problems this has created for policy making?
Yeah, not wanting to go too much over old ground, because in a way this was, described most famously and clearly by Edward Said in the late 70s. But in many ways, the tropes that he describes in that book actually do persist. So in terms of exceptionalism, we have the Middle East, as exceptionally violent, misogynistic, authoritarian, incompatible with democracy. Obviously, Islam features there as being incompatible with democracy, various forms of cultural backwardness, right? So all of those tropes persist in sort of knowledge production around the region, even if they are articulated perhaps in less explicit or even less racist ways than they may have been at different historical moments in the past. So let's take social violence in the Middle East will very often be framed as sectarian violence, right? So that comes from this exceptionalized worldview where the Middle East is seen as sort of its violence is sectarian, and that it's kind of culturally defined and innate to the region and innate to their culture. And so the violence is thereby ahistoricized, right? So whether or not it's articulated in some obviously racist way, or whether it's actually quite implicit, what you a priori do is just cut off a ton of avenues of exploration. So you can't really understand that violence. So any kind of policy that comes out of that is just not going to be very good. We can talk on the other hand about actively bad policy, but at a very basic level, it's just not going to be very good.
Well,
I'm going to address
what is the Middle East? What is the region, like when we talk about the Middle East? what region are we talking about? And do the people who live in it think of it, I mean, do they define its boundaries the same way that say, American policymakers or European policymakers do?
I mean, that is a huge question. I don't even know how
like
to
90
answer
seconds
that.
on that. John, you've had
Well,
two
actually,
years of thinking about this, so you're ready.
well, no, I mean, we can't talk about the Middle East, as a very constructed region. This is kind of what I was alluding to at the start, by Western powers, whether it was sort of European colonial powers or kind of that mantle being passed on to the US. But certainly there are self-perceptions also. When something is constructed, it doesn't mean it's not real, right? So it really exists as a region. We might argue about what the boundaries are. But to perhaps go back to a comment that you made earlier, Thanasi, about some of the reluctance in the working groups sometimes to make connections, I think that was not the case amongst anyone who works on the Middle East, right? So the Middle East, when people, especially if you work critically on the Middle East, you can't forget its geopolitical location, right? When you work on the Western, from and within the Western world, you can. So I think that perhaps tells us something about what we mean by these two regions here.
Yeah, and there's a couple of quick thoughts that came up in the project that have really stayed with me, and one is just how ubiquitous it is that, like, someone who works on literally any issue in the US would, like, if they wrote a book about it, they would call it police accountability, period. But if they were working on it in Egypt or Iraq, it would be police accountability in Iraq, because an idea in America is just an idea, but an idea out there is located there. And the other, I mean, there were lots of really cool insights that came out of this project, but one of the ones that I really also stayed with me a lot was the way Jacob Mundy talked about the Middle East being as a region created by the violence of Western intervention in it. And it really, I mean, it's a truism, but it's really revealing to me, like, what is the region we call the Middle East? It's the region where we're having wars. Like, it's a tautology, but it becomes, so like, why is Afghanistan in the Middle East for Americans after 9/11? I mean, look at a map. That's bizarre, right? Look where Afghanistan is compared to Morocco. How are those two countries in the same region? They don't speak the same language. They're on different continents. They're so far apart. Well, they're related because they are both, America's at war in both places under the same command, under central command. That's why it's the Middle East. And that's, as you said, it's made up, but it becomes real. And that's, I find super interesting. And I mean, the whole idea, it's middle, because compared to Whitehall, it's the Far East, the Near East, the Middle East, right? And yet you then have people in Arabic calling it al-Sharq al-Awsat, the Middle East. Like, you live there. What do you mean the middle of what? But it doesn't matter. It's now a term. Okay, so I think we could talk about this all day, but exceptionalism is really at the root of one of the things we tried to undo in this project, which is just to say, like, not that there aren't unique particularities, not that you're not special, but set that aside. Can you set that aside for long enough to see which ways in which you're not special? So Amanda, can we talk about American exceptionalism? And then Naira, you can jump in and say whatever it is you want to say.
Absolutely. I will say a number of my former students wanted to see this event. And I know that they're laughing right now because this is related to your question. It goes back to what you and Naira were discussing. On day one of my intro Middle East studies class, I do something that students have called the map torture exercise. And it's precisely to break down conceptions of exceptionalism, where I hand them a blank map of the Middle East, and the entire hour and a half of class is me saying, draw the boundaries of the Middle East in small groups, and then justify it to me, and walking around saying, no, you're wrong. Why? So by the end of the class, they just want to murder me. And then, the takeaway is it's a constructed region. We're not flat earthers in here, right? Like, So breaking down those kinds of assumptions, or I know that they're really enjoying that previous conversation, so thank you from them. On the topic of this essentialist construction of the other, right? You're asking me about the American component of that, of ourselves and in my context. I think that there is a particularly pernicious danger posed by the concept of American exceptionalism among its critics. And what I mean by that is this came into play in many of our discussions about the utility or possibility of comparing transnationally, because even people who would disavow, say, US hegemony across the region as being, the superpower that's supposed to be the world's policeman and that sort of definition of American exceptionalism, those same people, right, who are very critical of the idea of American exceptionalism, nonetheless keep it in power by not confronting it directly in a lot of these comparative questions. And so to illustrate that, I guess what I mean is that, people will take the white supremacist movement in the States less seriously, right, than they would the rise of ISIS. And while I'm not saying that the level of the violence day to day has ever been the same in that regard, obviously we're working in different geopolitical and historical contexts where the ballot box is something that is much more useful in the American context here now, right, for what people are trying to achieve. The problem comes in when analysts and academics and everyone thinking about these problems will dismiss grievances of an armed group, right? Because this is the United States, like I can understand why someone would join ISIS in a failing state conflict environment, but here, their complaints aren't valid. And while you might agree with that from your own position or perspective, say with neo-Nazis, right? You can't dismiss it out of hand as not a motivating factor because you are operating from a space of US exceptionalism, right? Where again, that normalization of violence as belonging to the Middle East and being the serious place that we address these issues comes up. Another example I think that would be relevant to this discussion because of Nicole's fantastic work on policing is there is an assumption in the States often that the police and the military here are apolitical, unlike, say, in Egypt, which comes up a lot, right? And so the idea of one of the things that I work on is neo-Nazi transnational infiltration of the armed forces around the world, as well as law enforcement. But getting people to take that seriously within an American context is very difficult, in no small part because of this American founding mythos of exceptionalism and the idea of having an apolitical law enforcement system, which is absurd, in the military as well. So,
yeah, and I mean it's important that we can recognize unique political cultures and goals that like different countries do have distinct political cultures and values and goals and rhetoric, and to say get rid of exceptionalism doesn't mean pretend we're all the same. Of course, different in different places there are different central ideas, but the American exceptionalism comes up a lot also in these assertions that then convince people not to think about certain eventualities. For example, we say we don't need to worry about coups in America because of our special racial, ethnic, indigenous commitment to democracy. When you ask why, there's not a good answer, right? Why is that not a risk here?
Well, can I jump in with a couple quick follow-up? There's also, I have to laugh at that because one of the emergent points of discourse after January 6th that came up a lot was that wasn't a real coup attempt, right? Because it wasn't violent enough.
Or because it was in America, therefore.
Well, yeah, but hold on. And I would push back with people and say, have you heard of Tunisia and Ben Ali and how he took power in Tunisia in a medical coup? These terms, you make assumptions about operating from thought paradigms that are socialized into us in this country that are very difficult to shake. I think the comparative process or comparative exercise is one way that those can be unsettled. So that's one point. The other point that I wanted to make sure and get out here is a little more on what I meant by it. The problem of exceptionalism is, I think, even more pervasive among its critics because it's more difficult to realize. So, people that claim the US has the decisive role in any given conflict are often the same people who will, rail against American exceptionalism. Nonetheless, it's the flip side of the coin that's operating. And I think that's very difficult for people to step back from in terms of an intellectual paradigm, unless they're forced to through juxtaposition of things like radically different areas like the Middle East or, I don't know, South Asia and the States.
So, Lubna, can you tell me how essentialism and exceptionalism distort the effort to seek accountability for rights abuses, and how, if at all, in your view, exceptionalism or essentialism in one country and region affected in another? And to be clear, what I mean by essentialism for our audience, that's the practice of imputing some idea about how people behave as a political group based on what some aspect of their identity is. Like, all Muslims will behave politically in this way, or all white people will behave politically in that way. That's what I mean when I say essentialism. Over to you.
So both essentialism and exceptionalism are play a big role in the situation in Egypt right now. So of course, every country is the greatest country, as we all know, in any moment of authoritarian rule. So first of all, this idea of a country being in such under such attack, everybody's your enemy, everything. I mean, basically, whoever is ruling has to protect this country against all kind of dangers, inside and outside, as Nicole was saying. Create this field where more and more of the exceptionalism of the moment and the country can actually turn into basically a green card to do whatever you want to do in when it comes to violence against citizens because they're enemies in the inside. But also I think the biggest issue when it comes to, and that we had in the conversation, and I was very happy to see they were able to surpass this. Usually in international conversations, this essentialism and exceptionalism makes it impossible for people to see reality, to understand the diversity in a certain country, the change. And people especially when it comes to the Middle East or Egypt, I mean, we're seen as this ahistorical country that keeps the same. And I think that the level of how dynamic Egypt has been for the last 10 years, even under this rule, it's been unbelievable. I mean, socially, the country is changing so much. Economically, the country is changing so much. Politically, it's changing so much. And a level of change that is unusual, actually, in 10 years. But still, because of this essentialism of what Egypt is, when it comes to an issue any moment of moral panic or issue related to women's rights, these are seen still as things that are not manifesting themselves in society in different ways, that society is changing, positions on even LGBT rights are changing so much in the last 10 years. It's sometimes too much to understand and realize as practitioners on the ground. And this essentialism and exceptionalism actually feed into the static image, which makes solidarity harder. And this is something that's very important to me. Because, I mean, after all, understanding all this, it's partially creating these kind of tools for solidarity. I mean, we try to understand each other partially for this. And it's impossible to be in solidarity with a group of people who do not change, who you see in a certain way, who culturally have to stay in a certain way. And I think it's it's the first basically step you have to break the essentialism and exceptionalism to move on. And the exceptionalism is you find it in something like the so-called Egyptian family values that became this big slogan under which people are prosecuted, people are put in jails. There's state campaigns on on what is the values of Egyptian family. But also when you look at the states are coordinating with each other on the issue of the family and protection of the family on the international level so much. And you find for example, Egypt, Russia, and Pakistan are basically one front. Are these three countries the same? No, they're not. And the state is aware that this exceptionalism and this essentialism are not true, that they find these similarities. And if we talk about family values, I think the US is a pioneer of family values and the kind of family values as a tool of ideology in like political debate. And so basically in reality, this exceptionalism and essentialism is not respected by the state, but it's projected on us. And part of how we can like understand in transnational way all our situations is actually to kind of like surpass this as a first step.
Well, and on
this answer the question.
Yeah, I think no, absolutely. And I mean in the course of this project, I've come to see this, I mean, a little bit differently than I did in the beginning, because there really does seem, I mean, okay, so like reactionary, anti-gay or anti all kinds of sort of repression is indigenous to a lot of countries in the world. I mean, it's in the US, we find it in Western Europe, we find it everywhere. And there is a lot of sharing between those reactionary movements across the world, sharing in solidarity as they promote the sort of reactionary or repressive or violent response. There's also a lot of sharing in solidarity among whether it's LGBTQ rights communities or women, I mean, women's rights. I dislike that as a term because it actually is kind of a set of bedrock universal principles that we're trying to demand minimal recognition for. But anyway, there's sort of transnational connections on both sides of this, and I think it's really interesting that like in places like Iraq and Syria. And Egypt, and even among Iranians, after gay marriage became legalized in the US, it started coming up in every conversation I had with like militants or reactionaries or politicians or police in the Middle East, where they'd bring this up and they'd be like, we're not going to become a country where two men can get married. And it was like, hey guys, that's not even on your agenda. Like in Iraqi Kurdistan in 2008, no one's talking about gay marriage. Why is this the thing you're worked up about? But yet it was. And I guess I'm interested in how much like even like a non-issue like that will come to the attention of reactionary or authoritarian forces, and then they'll either opportunistically use it or genuinely panic at the thought of these ideas coming to their conservative place, and does that like actually egg them into worse or sort of like preemptive repression, lest change come to their societies?
I think it's definitely these kind of any change in a country, especially a country well covered in the news like the US, has like a huge impact everywhere. So, for example, Netflix is like a political and social and legal phenomena in Egypt. I mean, it's like because we watch Netflix, young people watch it, like pirated mostly, but like there is a debate around this, and like shows related to Netflix will become a social phenomena. But also we're seeing that things that are the ways of organizing and social movements also inspired. I mean, it's not one way. It's not only the state that's inspired or like learn lessons. We also learn lessons. For example, Black Lives Matter as a period of like upheaval had like a big impact, and that you could see like young people in Egypt that are not usually very aware of like ethnic like situations or racial capitalism in the US, to be more honest, are like learning by this exposure because there is internet after all. So definitely these debates happen and have the impact on the actually kind of powers within a country, but also has an impact on like different groups and progressive groups. And you find that people can create these links between their lives and other people's lives. It doesn't have to be gay marriage specifically, but generally I think these debates feed into each other, and like kind of like we learn lessons. And there was and I think the fact that sometimes solidarity, that I spoke of solidarity, so I want to be very clear that sometimes when solidarity comes from the south to the north, it has like a totally different meaning, and it's a takeover and like kind of an attempt of to recreate the relationships of solidarity and kind of like redefine them. And I think that happened a couple of times that we've seen lately. And when you have like something in a country like Poland, for example, and or like the attacks on women's rights and like sexual and reproductive rights, that these becomes moments of learning, not only from the state and regressive groups, but also you find moments of learning from the feminist movement, for example. The same as the movement to basically decriminalize abortion in South America. So basically, these are moments of learning for both all sides. And they fuel a debate, they fuel sometimes an aggressive and maybe almost violent debates, but they're like feeding everyone, not only one side.
Nicole, I had wanted to ask you a question about blowback, but you, when we were preparing for the session, but you had something else you wanted to talk about, which is how we should talk about political violence. Your view on how we should change a little bit the way in which we frame and talk about political violence. And I think since on the back of what Lubna just brought up, it seemed like apropos to make that my last question to you before we run out of time.
Always with these very small questions of yours. Yeah, I mean, I think
you proposed this question.
I mean, I think sort of to pick up Lubna's point that, I think oftentimes we treat politics in the Arab region as epiphenomenal to US politics. And that means part of that means when we see violent political actors, we see them as expressions of cultural, theological, psychological pathologies and perversions, rather than as violent political actors. And we don't have to agree with ISIS to say that there's a politics driving ISIS. Now, we can think they're trashy politics, but that there is actually a politics animating their use of violence. And we don't have to agree with the use of violence as well. But I think, part of the conversation has to shift from just saying terrorists are these evildoers that George Bush sort of propagated following the September 11th attacks, to understanding that there are actually clear political demands that are both a response to US empire and US intervention, and also a clear sort of independent vision of different geopolitical arrangements and forms of global and regional governance that are conceptualized and theorized and fought for sort of connected to, but also independent of the U.S., right? And so to think of it more,
cause everything that happened in the world, right? It's
people have their own
one
politics.
factor among many.
Yeah, of course, yeah, and people have their own politics that we need to actually take seriously.
Well, I love it. We got through 2 rounds of our 4 rounds of questions, and we're almost at the end of our hour. You can find the work of this project at the Century Foundation's website, tcf.org. The project is called Transnational Trends in Citizenship. We've got several dozen dialogues, commentaries, reports, and podcasts that go into, I think, a great deal of really fascinating detail in the ways in which these networked crises and threats are connected, as are the responses to them. And for me, it's really changed the way I think about how to ask questions and how to learn about the policy crises of our time. And it's also really changed the way I understand the sort of, or not just the organic learning that takes place between authoritarians and regimes, but between those who are resisting them. So I'd like to thank the 4 of you for coming on the panel today. Naira Antoun, the director of the Transnational Trends in Citizenship Project, Lubna from EIPR, and Amanda from Century, and Nicole from the University of Illinois, Chicago. I think of all of you as being from your working group, so I have to look down and see what your real life affiliation is. Thank you so much for your time today and for your ideas, and I look forward to seeing how your work continues to change the way we approach the emergency that we're living through today.